It's strange how life can change in an instant. One minute, I was laughing in the kitchen with Mark, Luke's best friend, someone I'd known for years. And the next, my entire world came crashing down. Luke stood in the doorway, his face a mix of shock, betrayal, and rage. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. For a moment I froze, unable to speak. How could I explain? How could I possibly justify what I'd done? It all started innocently enough. At least, that's what I told myself. Mark had been a constant presence in our lives since the beginning of my marriage to Luke. He was charming, easy to talk to, and had a knack for making me laugh when I needed it most. At first, our conversations were casual. Jokes shared during game nights, light-hearted texts about mutual interests. But over time something shifted. I'd been feeling distant from Luke for months. Our once vibrant marriage had become a series of routines. Work, dinner, TV, sleep. We barely talked anymore. And when we did, it often ended in arguments. Mark, on the other hand, seemed to understand me in a way Luke no longer did. He listened, really listened, and made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. I knew it was wrong. I told myself it was harmless, that I'd never let it go too far. But then it did. The night it all fell apart. Mark had stopped by to drop off some tools Luke had lent him. Luke was supposed to be working late, and I'd invited Mark to stay for a drink. One drink turned into two, and before I knew it, we were laughing and reminiscing about old times. "I miss this," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Miss what?" Mark asked, his eyes searching mine. "Feeling connected," I admitted, looking down at my glass. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes said enough. When Luke walked in, I didn't even hear the door open. "Am I interrupting something?" he asked, his voice slicing through the air like a knife. Mark jumped up, stammering something about leaving, but Luke wasn't looking at him. He was looking at me. His eyes were filled with a mix of anger and hurt that I'd never seen before. "I think you should go," Luke said, his tone icy as he turned to Mark. Without a word, Mark grabbed his jacket and left, leaving me alone with my husband and the weight of my actions. "What the hell was that?" Luke demanded, his voice rising. "Nothing," I said quickly, my mind racing for an explanation. "We were just talking." "Talking?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Do you think I'm an idiot, Anna?" "No, of course not," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. "It wasn't what it looked like." "Then tell me," he said, stepping closer. "What was it?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? That night, Luke packed a bag and left. As I sat alone in our living room, the reality of what I'd done began to sink in. I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and now I had to face the consequences. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Megan, my sister. "What's going on?" "Luke just called me." I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. I hadn't told anyone about what had happened, but it was clear that Luke wasn't keeping it a secret. "Can we talk?" I replied, my hands trembling as I typed. When Megan came over later that day, her expression was a mix of concern and disappointment. "Anna," she said, sitting across from me. "What happened?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to tell her. "Luke caught me, with Mark," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Megan's eyes widened. "Mark? His best friend?" I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I don't even know how it happened," I said, my voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Megan listened patiently as I poured out everything. The distance between me and Luke, the way Mark had made me feel, the guilt I'd been carrying for weeks. "I don't know what to do," I said, finally wiping my eyes. "You need to talk to Luke," she said firmly. "But more importantly, you need to figure out why this happened. Because until you do, you're not going to find any peace." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. That night, I tried calling Luke, but he didn't answer. I texted him, apologizing and asking if we could talk, but all I got in response was a single message. "Not now." The silence was unbearable, but I knew I couldn't force him to forgive me, or even to listen. Over the next few days, I threw myself into work, hoping to distract myself from the mess I'd made. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the weight of my actions followed me everywhere. Every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was Luke. And every time it wasn't, I felt that hope slip further away. When Luke finally agreed to meet, I felt a mix of relief and dread. We sat across from each other at a quiet cafe, the tension between us palpable. "I don't even know where to start," I said, my voice trembling. "Then let me start," Luke said, his tone cold. "Why? Why him? Why my best friend?" "I don't know," I admitted, tears streaming down my face. I felt so alone, and Mark was there. "That's not an excuse," Luke said sharply. "I know," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Luke. I never wanted to hurt you." His expression softened for a moment, but then he shook his head. "I can't do this, Anna," he said quietly. "I can't stay in a marriage where I feel like I'm always looking over my shoulder." His words felt like a punch to the gut, but I knew he was right. Our marriage was over. The house felt like a stranger's after Luke left. His side of the bed was empty, his shoes no longer by the door, and his favorite mug was missing from the kitchen. Every room was a reminder of him, and of what I'd lost. I tried to tell myself I could fix it, that there was still a chance to make things right. But deep down I knew better. Luke was gone, and I had no one to blame but myself. Megan became my lifeline during those first few weeks. "You can't just wallow, Anna," she said one afternoon as she dragged me out of the house for coffee. "You need to figure out your next steps." "I don't even know where to start," I admitted, staring into my cup. "How about with yourself?" she suggested. "You've been so focused on Luke, on your marriage, on Mark. Maybe it's time to focus on you." Her words hit harder than I wanted to admit. I started therapy the following week. First, I was skeptical. Sitting across from a stranger and spilling my deepest secrets felt uncomfortable, even embarrassing. But my therapist, Dr. Jacobs, had a way of making me feel safe. "Affairs don't happen in a vacuum," she said during our second session. "They're often a symptom of deeper issues. Let's figure out what those issues are." Her words forced me to confront things I'd been avoiding for years: the cracks in my marriage, my feelings of inadequacy, and the loneliness I tried so hard to ignore. Meanwhile, Mark was doing his best to reach out. He called, texted, even showed up at my door once, but I couldn't bring myself to face him. What could he possibly say that would make this better? I asked Megan one evening as we shared a bottle of wine. "Probably nothing," she admitted. "But maybe talking to him will give you some closure." I wasn't sure I wanted closure, but I also didn't want to keep avoiding him. When I finally agreed to meet Mark, the conversation was as awkward as I'd expected. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I never should have let it go that far." "It wasn't just you," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "We both made that choice." He nodded, looking down at his hands. "Do you think there's any way to fix things with Luke?" "I don't know," I admitted, my throat tightening. "But I don't think it matters. He deserves better than this. Better than me." Mark left soon after, and as I watched him walk away, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a flicker of relief. For so long, I'd convinced myself that Mark had been a solution to my problems. But now I saw him for what he really was: a distraction from the issues I hadn't been willing to face. The divorce process was painful but necessary. Luke and I communicated through lawyers, dividing our assets and untangling the life we'd built together. There were moments when I wanted to reach out to him, to beg for another chance. But every time I picked up the phone, I stopped myself. I knew he'd made up his mind, and I couldn't blame him for that. One day, as I sorted through a box of old photos, I came across one from our wedding. We were standing under a canopy of trees, our faces glowing with happiness and hope. Looking at that photo, I felt a pang of sadness, not just for what we'd lost, but for the people we used to be. Over time, I began to rebuild my life piece by piece. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects and trying to find purpose in my career. I joined a yoga class, started journaling, and even signed up for a painting workshop, something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. For the first time in years, I was learning to be alone. One evening, Megan came over with a stack of takeout containers and a bottle of wine. "How are you holding up?" she asked as we settled onto the couch. "I'm getting there," I said, smiling faintly. "You seem lighter," she said, her tone thoughtful. "Lighter? Like you're finally letting go of all the guilt, she explained. Her words made me pause. I think I'm starting to forgive myself, I admitted. At the same time, therapy was helping me see my marriage in a new light. Do you think you and Luke were ever truly happy? Dr. Jacobs asked during one session. I thought we were, I said, my voice hesitant. But now I'm not so sure. What made you think you weren't enough for him? She pressed. I thought about it for a moment before answering. It wasn't about him. It was about me. I didn't feel like I was enough for myself. Her silence encouraged me to keep going. I think I used Mark as a way to escape, I continued. From my own insecurities, my own fear of failure. Dr. Jacobs nodded. That's an important realization, Anna. Now it's about figuring out how to stop running from those fears. Slowly, I started confronting those fears head-on. I said yes to things that scared me, trying new hobbies, meeting new people, and even going on a few dates. The dates didn't lead anywhere, but they reminded me that I was capable of connection, even after everything that had happened. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, I thought about the life I was creating. It wasn't perfect, and there were still days when I felt the weight of my mistakes. But it was mine, messy, beautiful, and entirely my own. After the divorce was finalized, I felt an odd mix of relief and loss. Relief because the endless cycle of guilt and conflict was finally over. Loss because the life I'd known for so long had officially come to an end. But in that loss, I saw an opportunity. A chance to start over, to figure out who I was outside of being Luke's wife or the woman who'd made so many mistakes. Megan continued to be my biggest cheerleader. You've got a clean slate now, she said one evening as we walked through the park. What are you going to do with it? I don't know, I admitted, kicking at a stray pebble. I feel like I've been in survival mode for so long. I don't even know what I want anymore. Then maybe it's time to find out, she said, her tone encouraging. I started small. I signed up for a cooking class, something I'd always been curious about but never made time for. I joined a local book club, even though the idea of meeting strangers made me nervous. To my surprise, I found joy in these little experiments. Cooking gave me a sense of accomplishment, and the book club introduced me to people who didn't know me as Luke's ex-wife. It felt like a fresh start. Therapy remained a cornerstone of my journey. During one session, Dr. Jacobs asked, "What have you learned about yourself through all of this?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought, I said. But I've also learned that I need to be honest, with myself and with the people in my life. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. Honesty is a powerful tool, Anna. It's how we build trust, with others and with ourselves. Her words stuck with me. At the same time, I started reconnecting with old friends. Sarah, a college friend I hadn't spoken to in years, reached out after hearing about my divorce. Let's grab coffee, she suggested. Catching up with her felt like stepping into a time capsule. We laughed about old memories and talked about how much our lives had changed. You seem different, Sarah said, her tone warm. I feel different, I admitted. It wasn't just a new chapter, it was a new version of me. One evening, as I sorted through old photos, I came across a picture of Luke and me from our first anniversary. We were smiling, holding hands, and looking at each other like nothing else in the world mattered. I stared at the photo for a long time, feeling a mix of sadness and gratitude. Our marriage hadn't lasted, but it had taught me so much about love, forgiveness, and the importance of knowing yourself. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself embracing new challenges. I started volunteering at a local shelter, helping organize events and fundraisers. The work was humbling and rewarding, a reminder of how much good there was in the world. Through volunteering, I met people who inspired me with their resilience and kindness. One woman, a single mother named Claire, shared her story with me during a quiet moment at the shelter. I've made a lot of mistakes, she said, her voice steady. But every day I try to do better. That's all we can do, right? Her words resonated deeply. At the same time, I began exploring my creative side. I took up painting, something I hadn't done since high school, and found solace in the process of putting brush to canvas. My first few attempts were clumsy, but over time I started to see improvement. Your work has so much emotion, Megan said one evening as she admired one of my pieces. Thanks, I said, feeling a flicker of pride. For the first time in years, I felt like I was creating something meaningful. Around the same time, I decided to reach out to Mark one last time. Not to rekindle anything but to find closure. We met at a park, sitting on a bench under the shade of a tree. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I said, my tone careful. "And I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for the part one played in all of this." Mark looked at me, his expression a mix of regret and relief. "I'm sorry too," he said, "for everything." It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a way to close the door on that chapter of my life. One evening, as I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, I thought about the woman I used to be. The one who'd felt trapped in her marriage, who'd made choices out of fear and insecurity. I wasn't that woman anymore. I was someone who'd faced her mistakes, learned from them, and found a way to move forward. And for the first time in years, I felt at peace with myself. By the time the leaves began to change, my life looked completely different. The little apartment I'd moved into after the divorce was finally starting to feel like home. I'd decorated it with pieces that reflected my new identity. Vivid paintings I'd made in my art class, cozy blankets for the couch, and a shelf full of books from my growing book club collection. It wasn't the life I'd envisioned when I married Luke, but it was mine. Work at the shelter became more fulfilling with each passing week. One evening, as I helped Claire organize donations, she turned to me and said, "You know, you've got a way of making people feel like they matter." Her words caught me off guard. "Really?" I asked, unsure how to respond. "Yeah," she said firmly. "It's not just what you say, it's how you listen. Like you're really paying attention." Her comment stayed with me, a reminder of how far I'd come. Around the same time, my relationship with Megan grew even stronger. She'd been my rock through everything, and now I felt like I could finally give back some of the support she'd given me. One weekend, I invited her to my apartment for a sister's night. "You've made this place so cozy," she said, curling up on the couch with a glass of wine. "I've tried," I said, smiling. "I'm proud of you, Anna," she said, her voice steady. "You've come a long way." Her words brought tears to my eyes. Meanwhile, therapy continued to be a cornerstone of my growth. During one session, Dr. Jacobs asked, "What would you say to Luke if you could talk to him now?" The question made me pause. "I think I'd tell him I'm sorry," I said finally. "Not just for what I did, but for the way I let our marriage fall apart without trying to fix it." "What do you think he'd say in return?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I hope he'd say he forgives me." Her silence encouraged me to reflect further. "And even if he doesn't," I added, "I think I'm learning to forgive myself." That sense of self-forgiveness started to show in other areas of my life. I no longer avoided the places Luke and I used to go or flinched when someone mentioned his name. When a mutual friend casually mentioned that Luke had started dating someone new, I felt a pang of something. Not quite jealousy, but a mix of sadness and acceptance. I wanted him to be happy, even if that happiness wasn't with me. Painting became a way to process those emotions. One evening, as I worked on a new piece, Megan stopped by to drop off some groceries. "What's this one about?" she asked, pointing to the canvas. "It's hard to explain," I said, stepping back to look at it. The painting was abstract, with swirls of deep blues and bursts of gold. "It looks like hope," Megan said thoughtfully. Her interpretation made me smile. One weekend, my book club hosted a charity event to raise money for the shelter. It was a lively gathering with a silent auction, live music, and plenty of conversation. One of my paintings was included in the auction, and to my surprise, it attracted quite a bit of attention. When the final bid was announced, I felt a mix of pride and disbelief. "People love your work," Sarah said, giving me a hug. "You should think about doing more with it." Her encouragement sparked an idea. A few weeks later, I started putting together a portfolio of my paintings. At first it felt strange, like I was putting a piece of my soul on display. But as I photographed each piece and wrote descriptions of what they meant to me, I realized how much I'd grown. Art wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was a way to connect with myself and others. One evening, as I walked home from the shelter, I received a text from Luke. It was short and unexpected. "I hope you're doing well." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "I am. I hope you are too." The exchange was brief, but it felt like a step toward closure. That night, as I sat on my balcony watching the city lights, I thought about how far I'd come. I wasn't the same person who'd made those mistakes, who'd let her insecurities dictate her choices. I was stronger, more self-aware, and finally at peace with the person I was becoming. By the time winter arrived, my life had taken on a rhythm that felt steady and fulfilling. Each day brought something new. A conversation that sparked reflection, a painting that expressed an emotion I couldn't put into words, or a moment of connection that reminded me of the beauty in starting over. The past no longer felt like a weight I couldn't carry. Instead, it felt like a chapter in a story that was still unfolding. At the shelter, I took on more responsibilities, helping to organize events and mentor new volunteers. One afternoon, as I worked on a fundraiser, Claire said, "You're like the glue that holds this place together." Her words made me laugh, but they also filled me with a quiet sense of pride. For so long I'd felt like I was falling apart. Now I was helping others hold their lives together. Around the same time, my art began to attract more attention. After the success of the charity auction, I decided to submit a few pieces to a local gallery. The process was nerve-wracking, and I second-guessed myself every step of the way. But when the gallery owner called to say my work had been accepted, I felt a surge of validation. "Your paintings have so much emotion," she said. "They tell a story people can connect with." Her words reminded me why I'd started painting in the first place. The gallery exhibit became a turning point. On opening night, I stood in a room filled with my artwork, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and strangers who had come to see my story on canvas. Megan was the first to toast. "To Anna," she said, raising her glass, "for turning pain into beauty and building a life that's truly her own." Her words brought tears to my eyes. As the exhibit gained attention, I began to receive commission requests. One client, a woman named Lisa, asked me to create a painting that captured her journey through grief and healing. "It's like you understand what I'm going through," she said when she saw the finished piece. Her words reminded me of the power of art, not just to express but to heal. At the same time, I started exploring new ways to connect with others. Megan convinced me to join her on a weekend hiking trip, something I'd never done before. "I don't know," I said as we packed our gear. "I'm not exactly the outdoorsy type." "You'll love it," she said, grinning. "Trust me." She was right. The crisp air, the stunning views, and the sense of accomplishment when we reached the summit were unlike anything I'd experienced. As we sat at the top of the trail looking out over the valley below, Megan said, "You seem so much lighter, Anna." "Lighter?" I asked, laughing. "Yeah," she said, her tone serious. "Like you've finally let go of all the guilt and started living for yourself." Her words stayed with me. That sense of freedom began to show in my relationships. I started dating again, not out of a need to fill a void, but out of a genuine curiosity about what the future might hold. One of those dates, a man named Ethan, stood out. He was kind, funny, and had a way of making me feel at ease. During our third date, as we walked through a holiday market, he asked, "What made you start painting?" The question caught me off guard. "It was a way to process everything I was going through," I admitted. "But now it feels like a way to celebrate how far I've come." Ethan smiled, his eyes warm. "I'd love to see your work sometime." As Ethan and I grew closer, I realized how much I'd changed. I wasn't looking for someone to save me or fix me. I was happy on my own. But his presence added something new to my life, something that felt light and genuine. One evening, as we walked through the park, Ethan turned to me and said, "You're incredible, Anna. I hope you know that." His words brought a smile to my face, but they also reminded me of something important. I was finally starting to believe it myself. The holidays that year felt different, quieter, but full of warmth. Megan, Sarah, and I hosted a small gathering at my apartment, complete with homemade food, laughter, and plenty of stories. As I looked around the room, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the people in my life, for the lessons I'd learned, and for the person I was becoming. That night, as I sat by the window watching the snow fall, I thought about Luke. I hadn't spoken to him in months, but I hoped he was happy. What we'd shared was over, but it had shaped me in ways I was only beginning to understand. And for the first time, I felt at peace with that. By the time spring arrived, I felt like I'd stepped into a version of myself I'd never imagined. The weight of the past no longer loomed over me. It was still there, of course, woven into the fabric of who I was, but it no longer defined me. Instead, my days were filled with purpose, creativity, and connection. The gallery exhibit had brought new opportunities, and I started splitting my time between commissions and teaching workshops. One of my favorite projects was a community mural, a collaborative piece that brought together people from all walks of life to create something beautiful. As we painted together, I realized how much joy came from sharing the creative process with others. One evening, as I cleaned up after a workshop, Ethan stopped by with takeout and a bottle of wine. "How's the masterpiece coming along?" he asked, nodding toward the mural. "Slowly but surely," I said, smiling. As we ate, we talked about everything, our dreams, our fears, and the small victories that made life meaningful. "You're amazing, Anna," he said, his tone sincere. His words made me pause. For the first time in years, I believed them. At the same time, my relationship with Megan continued to flourish. She'd been my anchor through the toughest times, and now I felt like I could finally return the favor. One weekend, we took a road trip to the coast, exploring small towns and walking along the beach. As we sat on the sand watching the waves, Megan said, "You've changed so much, Anna. I don't think I've ever seen you this happy." "I am happy," I said, smiling. Her words reminded me of how far I'd come, not just in rebuilding my life, but in finding joy in the present. Therapy remained a source of clarity and growth. During one session, Dr. Jacobs asked, "What does happiness look like for you now?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. "It's not about having everything figured out," I said. "It's about finding peace in the moments, the laughter with friends, the satisfaction of finishing a painting, the feeling of being loved for who I am." She nodded, her smile warm. "That's a powerful realization, Anna. Happiness isn't a destination, it's a practice." Her words resonated deeply. The mural project became a turning point. On the day we unveiled it, the community gathered to celebrate. Children pointed out their contributions with pride, and neighbors admired the vibrant colors and intricate designs. "It's beautiful," one woman said, her eyes shining. "Thank you for bringing us together like this." Her words reminded me of why I'd started this journey: to create, to connect, and to find meaning in the things that brought people together. As the months passed, my relationship with Ethan deepened. He wasn't just supportive, he challenged me to dream bigger, to step outside my comfort zone, and to believe in my own potential. One evening, as we walked through a quiet garden, he turned to me and said, "Have you ever thought about hosting your own art retreat?" The idea startled me. "Me? A retreat?" I said, laughing nervously. "Why not?" he said, his tone serious. "You've got the talent, the vision, and the heart to make it incredible." His encouragement planted a seed. Over the next few weeks, I started planning my first art retreat, a weekend getaway where participants could immerse themselves in creativity, nature, and reflection. The process was daunting, but it also felt exciting. A chance to share everything I'd learned and inspire others to explore their own creativity. The retreat turned out to be a success beyond anything I'd imagined. Held at a serene lakeside venue, it attracted people from all walks of life: artists, beginners, and everyone in between. By the end of the weekend, the participants left not only with their creations, but also with a renewed sense of connection and purpose. "This was incredible," one attendee said as she packed up her supplies. "Thank you for creating this space." Her words reminded me of how far I'd come. One evening, as Ethan and I sat on my balcony, he said, "You know, you should be really proud of yourself." "For what?" I asked, resting my head on his shoulder. "For everything," he said. "For rebuilding your life, for inspiring others, and for being the incredible person you are." His words brought tears to my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude for him, for my journey, and for the life I was creating. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the person I used to be, the one who'd felt trapped, insecure, and afraid. I wasn't that person anymore. I was someone who had faced her mistakes, learned from them, and found a way to thrive. And for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. By the time summer arrived, I felt like I was living a life I never could have imagined a few years ago. The retreat had sparked something in me, a sense of purpose that went beyond my art. It wasn't just about creating, it was about sharing, connecting, and helping others find their own voice through creativity. I started planning more retreats, each one a little bigger, a little more ambitious. And each one reminded me of how much I'd grown. One weekend, as Ethan and I strolled through a local farmer's market, he stopped to admire a booth selling handmade jewelry. "You know," he said, turning to me with a smile, "you should have your own booth here. Show people your paintings." The idea made me laugh. A farmer's market? For my art? "Why not?" he said. "It's all about community, right? And your art brings people together." His words stayed with me, and a month later I found myself setting up a small display at the market. The response was overwhelming. People stopped to admire the vibrant colors and intricate designs, asking about the stories behind each piece. One woman bought a painting on the spot, saying, "This reminds me of a moment I had with my mother before she passed. Thank you for capturing something so beautiful." Her words brought tears to my eyes. For so long, I'd used art to process my own emotions. Now I was seeing how it could touch others in ways I never expected. Around the same time, Megan convinced me to host a workshop at the shelter. "It doesn't have to be fancy," she said. "Just a way to give back to the community that's done so much for you." The workshop turned out to be one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. Watching people, many of whom had faced their own struggles, find joy in creating something with their hands was nothing short of magical. "It's amazing what you've built," Claire said after the session. "You're giving people hope, Anna." Her words reminded me of how far I'd come, not just as an artist but as a person. As the months passed, Ethan and I grew even closer. He wasn't just my partner. He was my biggest supporter, my confidant, and my best friend. One evening as we cooked dinner together, he said, "I have a feeling this is just the beginning for you." "What do you mean?" I asked, smiling. "I mean, you've created something incredible here," he said. "But I think you're meant for even bigger things." His faith in me was unwavering, and it gave me the courage to dream even bigger. One of those dreams came to fruition when I was invited to speak at a local arts conference. The idea of standing in front of a crowd terrified me, but Megan and Ethan both encouraged me to say yes. "Just tell your story," Megan said. "That's all you have to do." The day of the conference I stood on stage, my heart pounding as I looked out at the audience. "I used to think mistakes defined me," I began. "But I've learned that mistakes can be the beginning of something beautiful, if you let them." By the time I finished, the room erupted in applause. That night, as I sat on the balcony with Ethan, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. For the journey I'd been on, for the people who had supported me, and for the person I was becoming. One afternoon, as I cleaned out a drawer in my apartment, I came across an old photo of Luke and me. We were laughing, our arms wrapped around each other, looking carefree and in love. For a moment I felt a pang of sadness, not for what we'd lost, but for the people we used to be. I sent him a simple text. "Thank you for everything. I wish you all the best." His reply came quickly. "You too, Anna. I'm happy for you." It wasn't reconciliation, but it was closure. A quiet acknowledgement that we'd both found our own paths forward. By the time the year ended, my life was unrecognizable from where it had been. I had a thriving art business, meaningful relationships, and a sense of purpose that filled each day with joy. And for the first time in years I felt truly at peace. On New Year's Eve, as Ethan and I stood on the rooftop of his apartment watching fireworks light up the sky, he turned to me and said, "What's your resolution for next year?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. "To keep growing," I said, "and to keep creating a life I love." He smiled, pulling me close. "I think you're doing an amazing job." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The mistakes, the lessons, the growth. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Because in the end I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. And for the first time I truly believed I deserved it.